Welcome to the Diplomat Sofa. My name is Vladimir Radunovic. I'll be here with you on behalf of DiploFoundation as a host of this discussion. Today I have a great pleasure to have with me a very distinguished guest who is a non-diplomat who, by some circumstances, became sort of a super diplomat, if I can say. Mr. David Koh, he's a commissioner for cybersecurity and also a chief executive of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. As a commissioner, he takes care of, among other, protecting critical infrastructure and services in Singapore from cyber attacks. And as with his head of the Cybersecurity Agency, he's also worrying in a way, or working on national policies and policy environment, on operational mechanisms, but also on international affairs and international engagement. Mr. Koh, David, welcome and thank you for joining.
Vlada, thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here and my honor. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I want us to cover two particular aspects today. One would be more of the sort of a regulatory aspect, which is in a way your hands-on work, and we'll put a particular focus on the accountability of the vendors, of the producers of digital products. And the other perspective would be more diplomatic, which is especially when it comes to the role of non-governments and non-diplomats in diplomacy. Let's start with this first aspect, which is the regulatory aspect. Again, sort of your daily work. We know that particularly with the pandemic, the cybersecurity has become a very important issue. We are getting increasingly digitalized, and that's not the news. Many countries are trying to set some sort of a agency works and covering this. But I'm sure many also face a lot of challenges where to start from, what to focus on. Things are changing so fast. And Singapore is a very advanced, we have to admit, a country in that regards. What might be, I wouldn't say tips and tricks, but maybe some good experiences for small and developing countries, those with limited resources, on how to approach regulatory issues and policy issues on a national level when it comes to cybersecurity?
Thank you very much for the question, Vlada. As you said, it is my day job, as it were, my primary focus as Commissioner for Cybersecurity in Singapore, how to deal with this. First of all, I would say that the way that you've pitched the question is an excellent one. Very often when we find that conversations about the technical aspects of cybersecurity, we then delve and deepen the conversation very much to an operational or technical issue. But you have framed the issue, in my opinion, correctly, to say that it is not just merely a technical or operational issue, but rather it is a strategic and in fact a policy matter. And that I think is what I will confine my comments to. Firstly, as we all know, digitalization is upon us. And because of COVID, we have become much more dependent on digitalization and on the internet. What this implication is that the attack surface, the amount of avenues which the malicious actors can then exploit to attack us, has consequently increased as well. Now we have a fundamental dilemma. But what does this mean then for us? Well, first of all, I want to say that it does not mean that we should shy away from digitalization. Digitalization enables all countries, small countries, developing countries, and even large countries as well, to benefit from the promise that digitalization, new technologies can bring to our countries and communities, which includes raising the level of education, exposure, economic benefit. All of these are positive issues. However, it does mean that we have to manage the risks, and key among the risks is cybersecurity. So we have to manage cybersecurity as we digitalize. The way I see it is that cybersecurity is not an impediment to digitalization. Rather, we should see cybersecurity as a key enabler for digitalization. The analogy I would use is that cybersecurity are like the brakes on a car. If you want to go fast, you need good brakes. So that's how I would see cybersecurity. It then allows us to accrue the benefits of digitalization and enhance connectivity for our societies. So now, the question then from an operational perspective is, what are some of the things that we ought to look out for? some of the tips, as you were, or the experience that Singapore has faced. First of all, number one, secure critical infrastructure. These are systems, networks that provide essential services to your nation. Any kind of a disruption will cause impact for your citizens, your businesses, the country. This includes networks in the power, water, telecommunications, and government sectors. The approach that Singapore has taken is to have a Cybersecurity Act, a law. This legislation allows the government to proactively require the protection of critical infrastructure and ensure that these companies put in place cybersecurity measures to defend their networks and systems. This should be the first priority. Next, we should also think about beyond the critical infrastructure to the wider cyberspace. We are only as strong as the weakest link. So it's important for us to raise the cybersecurity posture of the entire nation, besides just the primary focus on critical infrastructure. This will include strengthening the protection of other companies, organizations, or even the public, the man in the street as well. In Singapore, we have also just started on this with the launch of a safer cyberspace master plan. The intent is to provide resources for enterprises, organizations, and individuals to help themselves stay safe and secure in cyberspace. A regulatory approach to cybersecurity in the wider cyberspace is unlikely to work. So the approach that we have taken is a light touch to encourage the adoption of good cybersecurity practices and measures and to provide resources to help them achieve this. Third, we need to support a rules-based multilateral order in cyberspace. This is pertinent for small and developing countries, including Singapore. Cyber threats are transnational, and in order to mitigate cybersecurity risk, you can't do it only at the domestic level. We need to subscribe to a rules-based order and work to develop and implement norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, as well as to facilitate cross-border cooperation. This will then ensure a safer, more secure, and predictable cyberspace, which will allow all countries, large and small, to leverage on technology for socio-economic opportunities and to reap the full benefits of digitalization.
Thank you, David. I particularly liked the two aspects that you mentioned. One is this positive look, which is not that often towards cybersecurity. We usually sort of not only frighten people sometimes necessarily, but sometimes unnecessarily, that it's all about security. We frame this as even disarmament where we have to, but it's actually, as you said, also the enabler, and we should be looking from that positive perspective. And the other is set of levels that you've set, that you mentioned that firstly it is a multidisciplinary, that it's not technical or just policy or just international affairs, it's really multidisciplinary. It is multi-level, it is from national to regional to global level, right? And multi-stakeholder, as you mentioned, it's definitely not just for the tech community or for the government, it's sort of a mix, and I guess you're a good representative of that in a way. But maybe linking to that and the roles of stakeholders, we always hear that the private sector plays a very important role, not least because they have the cutting edge when it comes to technology, and also basically they own 90% of whether it's infrastructure, services, the products, the software. And there is more and more discussions about vulnerabilities that there are in the systems of the producers, of the vendors, and what might be the way to make the vendors, the companies, more accountable, not just when it comes to Internet of Things, which is becoming more and more popular, but generally software, hardware. There are a number of discussions within the Paris Accord, Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior. And I wonder, Singapore again has quite some interesting solutions. The labeling scheme, a lot of cooperation with the private sector. What is this a good balance to approach the accountability of companies? On one hand, changing the demand of the users to ask for more secure products. On the other hand, maybe incentivizing the companies, and maybe on the third one, even with some more legal and obligatory approaches. Where is the balance?
Thanks. Another great question. Cybersecurity, as you say, is not just a technical operation, it's a multidisciplinary issue. And unlike many of the areas in the traditional security domain, it is one which does absolutely require a multi-stakeholder approach. cybersecurity is not something that governments, states can deal by themselves for a variety of reasons. One is that the infrastructure, a lot of it is held by private sector. The tools that we use, a lot of it is owned by the private sector. The critical infrastructure are also mostly private sector companies. And thirdly, the capability, a lot of it exists in the private sector. You find that some of the large enterprises have more technical capability, they have intelligence, and they have more operational capability than many small countries like Singapore. So it behooves us to find a way to work in this multi-stakeholder environment. Now, what are some of the things that we've done? I give you a small example. As you mentioned, we have got this cyber labeling scheme, which we have just introduced in Singapore. And this is trying to deal with many of the issues we talked about, how we can raise the level of awareness, how we can help to nudge and change user demand, make them want to buy products which are more cyber secure, and by so doing, change the incentives for the producers, for the industry, so that you will incentivize investment into more secure products, into security by design, certification, etc. How did we do this? Well, first of all, we recognize that the cybersecurity of a product is hidden at multiple levels and requires a great deal of technical knowledge. If you want to buy a baby monitor, if you want to buy an internet IoT device, if you want to buy a router, then for you to find out what actually is the cybersecurity of the product requires you to do a fair amount of research, probably requires you to have an engineering degree. The average consumer is not going to do this level of research. He or she is more interested in the functionality, at the most the price, and perhaps the color of the product. What level of cybersecurity it is just not top of mind. So how did we do this? We thought that the first thing is to try to make it accessible to the consumer. So how did we do this? We copied the idea from energy efficiency. Today, in many of our countries, if you want to buy a refrigerator, a washing machine, or some kind of electrical device, there is a energy efficiency mark on the product. You can see it, 1 tick, 2 ticks, 3 ticks, 4 ticks, and it's intuitive. The more ticks you have, the more efficient it is. So consumers can recognize this, and over time, they have changed their behavior, which now has also incentivized the manufacturers to similarly change their behavior. So we did something similar for cybersecurity within Singapore. What we did was that we came out with a cybersecurity labeling scheme to improve the security of IoT devices and provide a way for businesses and individuals to see the level of security of these products and help them nudge their decision-making process. This cyber labeling scheme will help consumers choose products with better cybersecurity ratings based on the labels using a simple 1-star, 2-star, 3-star model. And what we then hope to do is to encourage more manufacturers to come on, incorporate this into the devices that they make, and by so doing, differentiate themselves from their competitors. My device, my printer, my router, my baby monitor is more secure. And this might then become something which can differentiate themselves, become a value for themselves. So what we have done is we've launched this a few months ago. We've got several products already on the market in Singapore, and we've got about 60 more products which have registered with the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, my agency, to want to certify and accredit their products. Once they've finished the accreditation process, they will then be able to place these on their labels. So we've been very heartened, very surprised actually by the level of interest that this has taken on in Singapore. Increasingly, we also find that our international partners have also approached us to find out more about what we're doing in this front. This is a fairly novel initiative that we have started in Singapore, and we hope to now establish mutual recognition for the labels so that we can collectively, as an international community, advance security labels of IoT devices worldwide. We can use, therefore, market forces to cultivate an awareness and cultivate a recognition for the importance of cybersecurity. Now, at this point, we don't think that there is a need to regulate the producers of IoT devices. What we've started is a voluntary scheme. As I've said, we've already got more than 60 applicants coming in. Several of them are already on the marketplace in Singapore. We find that there seems to be a positive momentum, because some of the producers have found that this is useful, something which they can use to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And hopefully by leveraging on this awareness and the momentum, we don't need to consider right now anything more heavy-handed. We think that this gradual, voluntary, bottom-up approach seems to be working, and there's already a significant impact that we can make just on this approach. If things develop, depending on how things develop, we might consider whether there is a need for mandatory measures, but this will be much later on. As of now, the process is voluntary, and what we have found already, even with a voluntary system, there seems to be significant progress. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I think it's quite interesting that actually with this one approach, you managed, a soft regulatory approach, you managed to both change or try to change this demand by the users and also the behavior, incentivize the behavior of the producers. Now you mentioned one very important thing, is that there are other countries which are considering doing the same. The European Commission is developing its certification schemes. Many others are discussing, and even within the OECD, right? What are the good practices? Now, if we look at the supply chain, which is the digital supply chain, which is the buzzword of today, and probably under one of the hardest attacks or targets of the cyber attacks today, there are two aspects of the supply chain which are worrying. One is it is increasingly complex. There are software products which contain less than 10% in-house code and 90% of third-party code. The second component of that complexity is the globalization of the supply chain, and that all these components actually come from various jurisdictions. So I guess with all the efforts that you can do on the national level in Singapore, still many of the producers will actually use number of components in their products which come all around the world and might not be that secured. So the question is, how do you approach, how should we approach, and how do you approach this harmonization of, let's call them baseline requirements among different jurisdictions, different regulators, so that we sort of end up in a same world?
Thank you, Vlada. That's one of the biggest challenges that we face. Not a simple question, but it does. I don't have the answer. I'll start off by saying that I don't have the answer, but I totally agree. Supply chain is one of the big challenges that we are facing. And the recent sophisticated attack that we saw on the SolarWinds breach is a case in point. One of my counterparts put it this way, that SolarWinds was a company that none of us had heard about it, but everyone seems to be using it and depending on it. And it is frightening that there are such dependencies which we, even as professionals, are not aware of. And this increasingly is the nature of the environment that we live in. Our systems, networks are increasingly interconnected, and the supply chains of the computer products and services, they are complex and they are non-transparent. So this is really indeed a huge challenge that all of us are facing. So this is why the cybersecurity community is particularly concerned about cyber attacks on supply chains and downstream implications. As I said, I don't have the answer, but I'll share with you some of the thoughts of what we are thinking of, how we think that we can start the conversation and hopefully move the needle downstream. Firstly, the borderless nature of cyberspace is such that the attacks on any state or any service provider can easily be carried out by perpetrators based elsewhere. And as you've said, we are dependent on systems, network, software, which are housed or created in other countries. So what is essential for us that we need international cooperation. This is why Singapore is committed to work with our regional partners as well as international partners to establish rules, norms, principles of operating in a safer cyberspace, and in particular to prohibit such behavior which attacks and exploits vulnerable areas like supply chains. Clear rules are critical to drive responsible state behavior in the digital domain and prevent might makes right situation in cyberspace. Such discussions have been taking place at the United Nations. The UN, in my view, is an ideal place for these discussions to take place because it is one where all states are represented, and in fact, every state, whether large or small, has an equal voice. So two examples of this are at the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, a GGE, which has been taking place since 2004. And more recently, we have an open-ended working group, the OEWG, and there has been significant progress. And in particular, the expert groups have agreed on 11 voluntary non-binding norms recommended in the 2015 report of the UNGGE. This is a key reference point for the international cybersecurity discussions, including managing supply chain risks. One particular example I will cite is Norm 13I of this report seeks to address supply chain issues because it recommends reasonable steps to be taken to ensure the integrity of supply chains so that end users can have confidence in the security of the ICT products. Additionally, it calls on states to prevent the proliferation of malicious ICT tools and techniques and the use of harmful hidden functions. And the ongoing UNGGE also is developing an additional layer of understanding to these norms, and these will provide more guidance for the international community. We hope, therefore, by having this shared understanding of issues, stakeholders can collaborate and partner with each other to find synergies and then address these risks collectively. Now, how do we do this? The cyber digital environment is fast changing. It's more crucial for stakeholders, therefore, to work together to address these new emergent novel threats that has risen as a result of new technologies. Singapore is committed to a multi-stakeholder approach, and we actively engage non-state stakeholders to enhance operational as well as technical collaboration, as well as to discuss policy-related matters. This has sharpened our thinking, and we have benefited from the different perspectives, enabling us to develop more holistic policies and to make better informed decisions. In the need to recognize greater transparency and more dialogue, we also endeavor to bring together different stakeholders to facilitate discussions on wide-ranging security issues in the digital domain. One example is that we convene Singapore International Cyber Week every year, something that we have organized for the last 5 years, where both state as well as non-stakeholders can come together and deliberate on key issues and hopefully find a common cause to deal with some of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for these reflections. You actually touched upon diplomacy already, and it was an interesting introduction. I didn't expect it to go that way. I wanted to jump into diplomacy, but you, in a way, moved from this regulatory perspective, thinking about synchronizing, harmonizing the efforts into the norms. So, and that adds to the complexity of the environment, regulatory environment, global norms and principles, standards which are falling behind to some extent, particularly with software industry and so on, and then the corporate practices. Now, looking at this diplomacy efforts that you mentioned, certainly cyber is, well, it's something close to the heart of the geeks and companies maybe. Diplomats don't feel too comfortable with the cyberspace, right? Yet they have to be there. And what you listed, such as the UN discussions on supply chain, or the OECD discussions about vulnerability disclosure and generally the accountability of the private sector and the regulatory environment there, the work in the Asian and so on, that all seems to be overlapping between diplomacy and technical aspects and the work you do. So if you look at, try to be in the shoes of the diplomats, and again, particularly in small or developing countries with limited resources, how should diplomats get into this space, what they can learn from you or others to get involved in and understand this complexity of issues and just start working on that?
Thank you. This is something that's very close to my heart. Well, let me answer the question by sharing my own experience being head of the Cybersecurity Agency in Singapore. When I was first asked to head this agency, I was under the mistaken impression this is an operational and technical responsibility. My background, firstly, I'm an engineer. My background is in managing the operational and technical aspects of cybersecurity. So I thought that this is something that would be within my capability and something which was logical, now doing it at the national level. Instead, I found, to my great surprise, that well beyond that, the conversation is firstly at a policy level, as I've said, and secondly, at an international diplomatic level. I had to quickly find a way to deal with this new challenge. Coming from a small country, resources are limited. Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our State Department is not resourced to the level where we can have different bureaus dealing with different technical issues or emerging technologies for that matter, or much less cybersecurity. So when I approached our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to say that, look, there are diplomatic discussions on cybersecurity, you need to establish a division, a department to look with this. They told me immediately, we don't have the resources. We don't operate this way. We can't, as a small country, deal with it this way. Then I said, how shall we do it? And they said that we need to partner with the operational agency, i.e. myself, and then find a way to work together. They offered their diplomatic expertise and their resources, the embassies, etc. But they said that the core knowledge, the domain expertise would have to come from my agency. So for a small country like Singapore, what we've found is that we've had to partner together, both the MFA, which has the diplomatic policy background, as well as the line agency, my agency, which has the domain information background and experience. And by so doing, then we can able to represent our national interests at these fora. This is a huge challenge because the two domains typically don't mix very well. And I would say that the challenge is not in one particular direction, but rather in both directions. Engineers don't like to deal with diplomatic or policy matters. Most of the time we're in t-shirts and jeans. We're very comfortable there. We're not comfortable in a suit. I don't own that many suits. Now I had to learn how to operate in this new environment and speak in a different language. Diplomats, as you have pointed out, are not au fait with the technical and operational details. They don't want to delve. They're not engineers. They don't want to delve into the minutiae of one type of challenge versus another type of challenge. What is needed is people who are bilingual, as it were. People who understand enough of the technical issues that they know, perhaps not what the answers are, but what the questions ought to be, what the issues are, and then translate this and then able to discuss it at the policy level and at the diplomatic level. And we need policymakers who are sufficiently clued into this, as well as some engineers who are aware of the policy and cognizant of the policy issues and able to represent the national interest. So this core group of people who are bilingual, able to understand the operational technical language as well as to understand the policy and diplomatic language, this, in my opinion, is key. You don't need to be the best engineer, neither do you need to be the best diplomat. You need to be a little bit of both. I think for small countries, we have an inherent advantage because our bureaucracy exists, but our bureaucracy tends to be a little bit smaller, and we are able to call everyone into we know one another, and we're able to have a meeting and bring all the stakeholders together into one room. So the opportunities for us to coordinate probably are higher than in a large country. So yes, there are advantages in large countries. They have the resources, etc. But I would also highlight that small developing countries are not necessarily disadvantaged. We do need to find an opportunity and a way to work collaboratively together within ourselves so that we can coordinate across the operational, technical, diplomatic policy divide. But once we are able to do so, I believe that small countries should be able to coordinate better, and we are arguably more nimble in terms of our approaches. So I think that there's great opportunity. for small countries to operate in this new domain. Digitalization requires us to cross this domain where policymakers have to understand some elements of the operational technical domain, and the operational and technical people need to recognize that the solutions are not always technical in nature, but they are illuminated or they're impacted by the policy considerations as well as the international diplomacy issues. So I think this is my take on the issue. I don't think the answer lies exclusively with one group of people or the other group of people. Rather, you need an intermix of the two, multi-stakeholder, multi-disciplinary approach, as you have said. And we need to find people who are bilingual, able to operate comfortably in both domains.
Thank you, David, for these excellent examples from Singapore. I think two things stand out. One is this, as you said, bilingual and the cooperation between different stakeholders. And I think your analogy with dressing code is quite interesting. I remember back in the days of the first World Summit of Information Society in Geneva, 2003, and even in Tunis, 2005, you could clearly say who's coming from the government, who's coming from the private sector, from the tech community. You know, the techs were in this Hawaii shirt with flip-flops and the governments were with ties and so on. But as the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, evolved through years, now if you go to the IGF and many other places, you can't actually say who's who, because you see more and more diplomats in a rather relaxed manner, and even the tech community with ties. That shows that this language is actually, this bilingualism is being developed, and that's a good news. And it's also quite important what you mentioned as a sort of a push, a motivation to developing, particularly small countries. It's easier to manage to put all together. What I like is your example of you approaching the Ministries of Foreign Affairs. Sometimes we discuss or we expect that the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and diplomats themselves would be the one who have to jump into cyber, and they don't necessarily do that. They don't feel comfortable. And your example shows that if you, as an agency or anyone else, is actually into this topic, but you're missing the diplomatic part, you can be the one who initiates this change. And more even than that, and you mentioned that the role of the Singapore as a small country, is that you can actually be the leader in the region. Now, I want to raise the question, certainly you can reflect to the previous part, but raise the question of the importance of regional dialogue. And Asian, as a region, is quite vivid these days and these years in capacity building, in confidence building measures. And you again and Singapore play quite an important role in that regards. How do you see the role of the regional dialogue and cooperation, both among diplomats and other institutions?
Thank you, Vlada. I want to say, first of all, I earnestly believe that cybersecurity is a team sport. You know, no one person, no one agency, no one country, no one set of stakeholders can deal with it. We have to play together. So within the country, it's a team sport. It has to be a multi-agency, collaborative, multidisciplinary effort. Then the country can't deal with it by itself. You have to have regional cooperation, international cooperation. And as we've discussed, governments can't deal with it by ourselves. We need a multi-stakeholder approach. And I think that guides a lot of our thinking. You talk about the role of regional organizations. Let me share what has happened within the region that I come from, Southeast Asia. So we have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. When we first started the role, we thought that earnestly that there was an urgent need to raise the level of cybersecurity awareness within the region. Why? Because ASEAN is 600 plus million people who are trying earnestly to raise their level of economic development, socio-economic development, and reach and gain the benefits of the ICT and digital revolution. But if we don't socialize them to cybersecurity, cybercrime threats, then this will be 600 plus million people who will then be exposed to all the cyber criminals and all the cybercrime of the world. So we felt that it was imperative quickly to raise the awareness and then raise that eagerness for us to want to work together to deal with this. We've been successful in that respect. And once you raise the awareness, then the next question is, what do you do about it? So that's where we then had to transit to confidence building measures and capacity building measures. So I will share with you an interesting story about how we started this cooperation within ASEAN. Well, I briefed my minister and I said that we need to deal with this. And we said that we can invite them all to the conference. So then my minister said that, okay, that's a challenge because most other countries don't have a minister in charge of cybersecurity. So whom do we invite? My minister then came out with a great idea. He said that, look, I have already got an existing conference for all the telecommunications ministers in ASEAN. So I will go there and invite my counterpart. And what he did was that he invited all his counterparts and he told them, bring a friend, whoever in your country is responsible for cybersecurity. So our first conference that we had, we didn't even know who was coming. So we had one set of invitations to all the ministers in charge of telecommunications. And then we told each of them, bring a friend. The first year, we had some people from the Ministry of Interior, the Police Ministry, some from the Armed Forces, some from the Cabinet Office or the Prime Minister's Office, etc. We started the conversation. By the second year, we found that the conversation had gone back to their own capitals. And they have now decided that internally they need to organize themselves and ask themselves how they wish to be represented and organized operationally for cybersecurity measures at ASEAN level. And by the second year, we found that we had different representation at the ministerial meeting. And finally, by the third year, we have reports that they have set up their own agency. They've decided they'll be in the Cabinet Office. They've decided they'll be in the Prime Minister's Office, etc. So we saw for ourselves a very quick evolution, thinking, maturity, etc. within ASEAN. I will not say that Singapore played a very important role. What I would say is that our actions played a catalytic role. When we invited it, when we started the conversation, it was the catalyst for them then to go back and to begin the conversation. Each country has its own history, its own dynamics, its own political considerations on how best to organize. So that was what our experience in ASEAN was. Today, ASEAN has a whole range of efforts on this front. So one of them is the ASEAN Cybersecurity Coordinating Committee, where we have it among the senior officials in the ASEAN grouping. We also have long-term roadmaps among the different states. And we have capacity building efforts under two separate centers. One is the ASEAN-Japan Cybersecurity Capacity Building Center, which is based in Bangkok. And the other is an ASEAN-Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is based in Singapore. So we work together, even though there are two different centers, and we try to be complementary to each other. ASEAN also has a CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team drill, and we are working towards creating an upcoming ASEAN Computer Emergency Response Team itself. In addition, we also have the ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity, where we have meetings at the ministerial level to discuss how this cooperation at the regional level can go forward. So guided by our regional documents, such as the ASEAN Leaders Statement, which was established in 2018, as well as the ASEAN Digital Master Plan for 2025, and the ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Strategy Papers, all these initiatives support the ASEAN member states with the same goal in mind. And this is not just for cybersecurity's sake, but rather to build on the region's collective capabilities so that we can all prosper and progress together to leverage on ICT for socio-economic development and through a safer cyberspace for our region and beyond. The efforts for regional organizations like ASEAN, efforts like these that we undertake to implement the international cyber normative framework complement the conversations that are taking place at the United Nations. At the same time, the UN discussions will also benefit from the experiences of the regional organizations. At the UN level, it tends to be at a very high level almost at a conceptual, at a principle level. How this is then translated, perhaps benefits from the conversations which take place at the regional level. Because at the regional level, the numbers of countries is more manageable. You're all in the same time zone, more or less, and you have some neighbor common experiences, either because you're in the same neighborhood, share similar cultural or historical context. So there is cross benefit between from the regional to the UN, as well as from the region down back to the region, UN level, international down to the region. So I think this is something which I believe is complementary. And clearly, I think considering the transnational nature of cyber threats, it's important to take both a regional as well as an international approach to address the challenges of cybersecurity. Because as I said, we're only as strong as the weakest link. So cyber capacity building also helps us not just to strengthen the country that's benefiting from it, but also to collective cyber posture for the entire region. And it'll enable countries to contribute meaningfully to international discussions. The capacity building that we are undertaking in ASEAN is not limited only to the operational and technical aspects. We also have capacity building to have discussions at the policy level. How do you organize your country for cybersecurity? Should you have an independent agency? How do you cooperate across multidisciplinary arenas, etc.? And thirdly, it also talks about the cyber diplomacy. So there are different tracks in terms of our capacity building. We think all of this collectively works towards contributing towards greater resilience and security in cyberspace. Thank you.
Very, very rich and very important experiences. Thank you, David, for this. Well, I guess this takes a lot of time to coordinate. But I guess on the top of that, and that's where I want to basically move to the last section of our discussion, because this will be watched by both diplomats and non-diplomats. I want to briefly reflect on the roles of non-diplomats. That means businesses and civil society, academia, well, regulators as well, in this diplomatic process. And within the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group, which ended with a great compromise and an agreement by all the states, one of the most praised elements of the UN Open-Ended Working Group was actually this multi-stakeholder track in a way. And one particular event was what you chaired yourself, was a sort of a multi-stakeholder discussion negotiations, probably something quite specific for the UN environment, and maybe even more for security environment. Security environment is traditionally kept by states for themselves and so on. It seems to be opening up. So my question to you is also from your own personal experience, on the level of negotiations, shaping the agenda, and certainly afterwards implementation of that, agreements, whatever it is, what are the roles of other stakeholders, and how did you see their contributions of businesses, civil society and others within the Open-Ended Working Group, and maybe within the Asian as well, ASEAN?
Thank you very much. First, I would say that the role of non-diplomats, as you said, I myself am a non-diplomat. So to start off, I would say that within your own country, it has to be a multi-stakeholder approach within your own country to begin with. It is not naturally the responsibility of the MFA or the State Department in your country that you have to take part in the international cyber conversations. As I said, in our own experience, I think one of the driving forces was my own agency, the recognition that these are taking place and we need to participate or it will impact our country and our interests may or may not be recognized. So from a national interest perspective, it is important for you to recognize that your country ought to have a voice at these conversations. Now then, internally within the country, you have to decide whether it is best placed for a diplomat or a non-diplomatic track to advance this. My own reflections are that neither can do it by themselves. You need a partnership. The diplomatic mechanisms need to be illuminated by the operational technical domain expertise. And the domain people, who are mostly engineers, don't have the skill sets, diplomatic skill sets to do this. So you need a combination of the two in order to ensure that your own country's national interests are represented and that you have a voice at this. So I would urge all of you to recognize this and participate actively. So far, in the last 2 years at the open-ended working group, we have found very active participation by many of the countries who traditionally would not be seen to be among the cyber powers of the world. Countries who we didn't recognize were interested in the cyber domains, but they made very useful, very, I think, appropriate interventions at the open-ended working group at the UN. Many of them were, of course, the statements were delivered by the diplomats of that country who are based in New York. But listening to the comments, listening to the interventions, it was clear that the comments and the interventions were coming from capital, from people who were domain experts, people like myself, who then said that these are the interests of the country, these are our concerns, etc. It is essential for us to have these conversations because in that broader conversation, which involved 193 countries, then we find that the interests of the small developing countries are quite different from the interests of perhaps the more developed states. They perhaps are more interested in the disarmament issues. Many of the developing countries are more concerned about cybercrime, how it impacts their societies, how it places a drag on the opportunities which digitalization and ICT technologies afford for the betterment of society. And as an international community, we need to deal with some of these challenges and how best to deal with both sets of concerns. Both are legitimate concerns. Now, as part of the OAWG, as you said, we also had an intersessional meeting for multi-stakeholders. I had the opportunity and the honor to chair this. One of my first opportunities to play as a little bit of a diplomat at this arena. And this was an eye-opening experience. I'll share with you two key takeaways that I had. But one thing that I wanted to start off with was to say, why did we think that there was a need for this intersessional meeting involving multi-stakeholders? And the reason is because unlike the traditional domains of security, where states, by and large, have a monopoly of the capabilities for traditional security matters, or they have a monopoly for the intelligence for traditional security matters, or perhaps they have a monopoly in terms of the technical wherewithal. In all of these three areas, for cybersecurity, states do not have a monopoly. In cybersecurity, there are significant non-state actors who have operational capability as much as or even better than states. In the area of intelligence, there are non-state actors, big companies who have more intelligence and have greater intelligence capabilities than many states. And lastly, in terms of technical know-how, many of the advanced cybersecurity companies have greater technical capability than many nation states. So because of all of these reasons, then when we have the discussions, it is important that states themselves cannot just have these discussions by themselves. We have to include these non-state actors because they are also an important constituency. They have real capability and they have very useful perspectives to bring to the conversation. So I had the honor to chair this session in February of last year. It seems like an eternity away at another time. We had it a physical meeting. And I remember the big hall in the United Nations, there were 100 over representatives from agencies, companies, non-profit organizations, foundations from all over the world. It was truly an eye-opening experience for me. I have two key takeaways from this intersessional meeting. The first is that governments alone do not have all the answers for cyberspace. We learned a lot during the intersessional meetings that non-stakeholders have innovative solutions and they can help make our cyberspace safer. For example, the norm on the protection of the core of the internet was proposed by the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, GCSC. This is a civil society organization, and it was echoed subsequently and supported by state as well as non-state stakeholders alike. Non-state stakeholders not only provide innovative proposals, but also raise sound questions. This will help us to refine our thinking. For example, Microsoft highlighted the importance of developing an all-of-government approach. All too often, current capacity building efforts tend to focus on only the technical aspects of cybersecurity at the expense of others like diplomatic, judicial, law enforcement capabilities. Microsoft called for more to be done in the other areas of government, including strengthening cyber diplomacy capabilities of countries, something that Ambassador Lauber, the chair of the OEWG, mentioned as well. This would then equip states to participate in conversations on a more level playing field. Other contributions by another organization, Research ICT Africa, also raised very pertinent questions about the applicability and the relevance of the 11 GGE norms to several African states. They asserted that it was difficult to comply with the norms because of the relatively low cyber maturity of developing nations. I believe that this issue goes beyond the African continent. It applies to developing nations all over the world. To this end, Research ICT Africa also provided some solutions to the issues that they raise. So cyber capacity building is necessary to support governments to observe the non-binding voluntary norms. You can't observe the norms if you don't have the capacity, the operational or the technical capacity to actually execute this. So this is one specific area of follow-up. And we agree with them and Microsoft in advocating for better coordination and a more holistic approach towards cyber capacity building. My second key takeaway from the intersessional meeting is that it's not sufficient just to have multi-stakeholder consultation. Consultation is good, but what we need is more multi-stakeholder cooperation. A public-private partnership, for instance. While states have focused on identifying and securing their national critical infrastructure, we should not forget about another class of infrastructure, something which some people have termed supranational or cross-border CIIs. CIIs that exist beyond the national borders of any particular country. We need to safeguard this type of CIIs, where disruptions would affect more than one state. This could include banking services, for example, which facilitate cross-border transfers, or airline booking systems, which hold billions of passenger information, all in the cloud, for example. We must not overlook supranational or cross-border CIIs in our discussions on critical infrastructure. We need to prevent cyber criminals from taking advantage of vulnerabilities in such CIIs because they cross the jurisdiction and the domains of any particular country. As we strengthen other aspects of CII, this is one area which we must not forget. As a small state, Singapore does not have control or levers over these privately owned cross-border CIIs, which are often owned by very large corporations. We hope that states can band together, work cooperatively with owners of such CIIs to safeguard themselves from cyber attacks. The solution will require both states and private companies to work together in some kind of public-private partnership approach to safeguard CIIs from cyber threats. Thank you.
David, I started with announcing you as a non-diplomat who sort of became a super diplomat. And I want to end in that way. You mentioned the differences in professional cultures, in communication, understanding the process, in pace of work between different stakeholders, particularly diplomats and non-diplomats. Now, from your personal experience, as being someone who has dived into diplomacy, maybe even not being ready for that fully, what would be some tips and tricks for non-diplomats that have to participate or want to participate in these cybersecurity negotiations what should they learn about? What should they maybe accept and admit and live with when it comes to diplomatic world? How should they prepare to play that role?
Thank you very much. I would adjust the question to say that I think both sides need to learn. So I'll begin firstly to say that diplomats, policymakers need to recognize that there is an element of the technical or the operational elements which they need to understand. That falls on people like myself to then be able to distill what exactly are the key elements of the technology, the operational issues, which we can then educate you and share with you that these are the key elements. Not to delve into the technical details, but to recognize that, look, these are the key issues, why they're important, and what the policy trade-offs are. From a technical perspective, there's no straightforward answer. There are always trade-offs. So the issue from a national perspective is to recognize what the trade-offs are. I admit the operational and technical community don't do a good job in distilling what are the key essentials of the operational and technical domain, which we want our policymakers, our diplomats to understand, and then to frame this as to what are the key trade-offs that we need to consider. On the other side, what are the key things which operational, technical people, engineers like myself have to learn, have to consider if we need to come into this diplomatic world? First of all, my biggest takeaway is that from an engineer's perspective, everything ultimately can be solved. It is a technical answer. If you work hard enough, you will get an answer. In the diplomatic arena, this is not always the case. When I first was introduced to the 11 norms of responsible state behavior from the 2015 GGE report, my first instinct as an operational leader, as a technical, as an engineer, was to understand, okay, if this is the norm, how do I execute this? I found that some of the norms were written in a less than clear language, seemed to be vague, seemed to allow for some misunderstanding, misinterpretations, or different interpretations. As an engineer, I needed clarity. My colleagues and I said, we need to understand exactly what this means so that we need to know whether we do A or B. What I've learned in these last 5 years on the diplomatic circuit is that this is the fundamental difference between the operational and technical community and the diplomatic community. The diplomatic community achieved a great success because they found a diplomatic solution which was acceptable to different stakeholders. It is precisely because the language is written in such a way, it allows for more than one interpretation, so that those who want to interpret it, that we will execute it by doing A, are happy. And at the same time, those who interpret it and say that we intend to execute B are also happy, and we can have a diplomatic answer. This was initially anathema to operational and technical colleagues. So we had to learn that the art of diplomacy is the art of the possible. So we have to allow for this training to take root so that we can accept that for certain solution spaces, we have to come out with a possible agreement which allows for more than one operational or technical solution. This will be difficult for an engineer to accept, but this is precisely the main language that I learned on this diplomatic circuit. This is my advice to those of us who are in the operational or technical arena, who then have to come and operate at this diplomatic arena. The second takeaway was that we also would very much want convergence, one process. As I was explaining at the start, at the United Nations, we have two processes ongoing at the same time. My agency, my country is represented at both processes. Senior diplomats from my country have explained to me, this is again normal in the diplomatic arena, that we have sometimes more than one process. Sometimes we have overlapping mandates, overlapping responsibilities, but as part of the process, it's acceptable. There is no need for us to have a clear-cut demarcation, and one agency does work here and another agency does work there. In the diplomatic arena, it is normal that we have more than one solution, more than one process, so that this variable geometry, as one of my senior diplomatic friends advised me, can bring the process forward. And so long as the outcome of the process is that we have brought the conversation forward, we have increased the level of understanding, and we have increased the level of cooperation, then we have definitely made things better. So these are the two takeaways that I'll take for non-diplomats as we enter into this arena.
Thank you, David. And I think you're a great example of a techie who managed well in diplomacy. We have some good examples, including Ambassador Lauber, who are not techies, but actually managing cyber aspects quite well. So this is good news, and I think quite a hope for everyone. Thanks a lot. We'll definitely have a lot more questions, but time is up. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll certainly continue this discussion.
Vlada, thank you very much. It was my pleasure as always.
Thank you for joining us. This is the end of today's Diplomat so far. Our guest was Mr. David Koh, Commissioner for Cybersecurity and Chief Executive of Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. You can follow more on cybersecurity policy and international negotiations on Diplo's digital watch website, dig.watch, and see you soon with some more great coverage. Bye-bye.